Margaret was not the kind of person who liked to draw attention to herself. She lived a quiet, humble life filled with simple pleasures, tending to her garden, baking pies for neighbors, and taking long walks around her small town. But on this particular afternoon, Margaret found herself stepping out of her comfort zone. For months she had been saving money from her pension to buy a new car. Her old sedan had served her well, but it was now showing its age, sputtering and groaning every time she turned the key. Margaret didn't need anything fancy. A reliable vehicle that could get her to the grocery store and doctor's appointments would do just fine. With a mix of excitement and nervousness, Margaret decided to visit one of the most prestigious car dealerships in town. It wasn't because she wanted luxury. It was simply closer to her home than the others. As she stepped through the glass doors of the showroom, she felt a little out of place. The sleek cars gleamed under bright lights, their polished surfaces reflecting the elegance of the space. Salespeople in sharp suits moved swiftly between customers, exchanging handshakes and confident smiles. Margaret tightened her grip on her purse and approached the nearest salesperson. "Excuse me," she said softly, trying to catch his attention. The young man glanced down at her briefly before turning back to another customer he was assisting. Margaret waited patiently, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. When the man finally acknowledged her after several minutes, his tone was dismissive. "Yes, ma'am. Can I help you?" he asked, barely looking at her. Margaret explained that she was interested in learning more about the cars available, particularly those within her budget. She mentioned her savings and asked if they offered any financing options. The salesperson gave her a quick once-over, taking in her modest cardigan, practical shoes, and weathered hands. Without hesitation, he assumed she couldn't afford anything in the showroom. "These models might be a bit out of your price range," he said curtly, gesturing vaguely toward the expensive vehicles around them. "Maybe try somewhere else." Feeling embarrassed but unwilling to give up, Margaret approached another salesperson. This time she was met with a forced smile and a string of rehearsed platitudes. "Of course, we have something for everyone. Here," the woman chirped, though her eyes darted away as soon as Margaret began asking detailed questions about pricing and payment plans. After a few moments of half-hearted answers, the woman excused herself, saying she needed to check on another customer. Margaret stood alone again, clutching her purse tightly as she tried to gather her thoughts. As the hours passed, Margaret realized she wasn't going to get the help she needed. Every interaction followed the same pattern: polite indifference or outright dismissal. No one seemed willing to take her seriously. One salesperson even laughed when she mentioned her savings, making a joke about bringing more cash next time. Margaret's cheeks burned with humiliation, but she refused to let tears fall. Instead, she thanked the staff politely, knowing full well they hadn't earned her gratitude, and walked out of the dealership with her head held high. On the bus ride home, Margaret replayed the day's events in her mind. She thought about the way the salespeople had treated her, as if her appearance determined her worth. They didn't know that she had worked hard her entire life, raising 2 children on her own after her first husband passed away. They didn't know that she had spent decades working late shifts at a factory to provide for her family. And they certainly didn't know that the man waiting for her at home was none other than Arthur Caldwell, a retired entrepreneur who had quietly amassed a fortune before choosing to live a simpler life. When Margaret arrived home, she found Arthur sitting in his favorite armchair by the window, reading the newspaper. He looked up as she entered, immediately sensing that something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked, setting the paper aside. Margaret hesitated at first, not wanting to burden him with her troubles, but eventually, she told him everything. She described the condescending looks, the dismissive remarks, and the overwhelming sense of being invisible. Arthur listened intently, his jaw tightening with each word. By the time Margaret finished speaking, his usually calm demeanor had shifted into quiet fury. "They judged you based on how you look," he said, shaking his head. "But tomorrow, we'll show them exactly who they're dealing with." Though Margaret tried to brush off the incident, insisting it wasn't worth pursuing, Arthur had already made up his mind. He knew what he had to do. and he was going to make sure the people at that dealership never forgot the lesson they were about to learn. That evening, the house was unusually quiet. Margaret busied herself in the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner of roasted chicken and mashed potatoes, while Arthur sat at the dining table, his mind racing with thoughts about what had happened earlier that day. He couldn't shake the image of Margaret walking out of the dealership, her shoulders slightly slumped, her usual confidence dimmed by the cruel treatment she had endured. It wasn't just the rudeness that bothered him. It was the sheer arrogance of the salespeople who had dismissed her without even giving her a chance. Arthur Caldwell wasn't a man who sought attention or flaunted his wealth. In fact, most people in their small town didn't know much about him beyond the fact that he was Margaret's husband, a kind, soft-spoken man who loved gardening and tinkering with old clocks. What they didn't realize was that Arthur had once been one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the region. Decades ago, he had built a thriving business empire from scratch, amassing a fortune that would have allowed him to live in luxury for the rest of his life. But instead of indulging in extravagance, Arthur sold his company when he turned 60 and chose to live a simpler, quieter existence with Margaret. They moved to a modest home on the outskirts of town, where they could enjoy their golden years, surrounded by nature and peace. Despite his decision to step away from the world of wealth and power, Arthur still retained a few reminders of his past life. One of those reminders was parked in their garage, a pristine vintage Rolls-Royce Phantom. The car was a masterpiece, its sleek black exterior gleaming like polished obsidian, its leather interior as smooth and supple as the day it was crafted. Arthur rarely drove it. He preferred their reliable family sedan for everyday errands. But today, he knew it was time to bring it out of retirement. As Margaret set the table and served dinner, Arthur finally spoke. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice calm but firm. "Tomorrow we're going back to that dealership." Margaret froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. "What? Why would we do that?" she asked, her brow furrowing with concern. "They made me feel terrible today. I don't want to go through that again." "You won't," Arthur assured her, leaning forward slightly. "But they need to understand what they did wrong. They judged you based on how you look, not realizing who you are or who we are. Tomorrow will show them exactly what they missed." Margaret sighed, shaking her head. "It's not worth it, Arthur. Let's just forget about it and move on." But Arthur wouldn't hear of it. "No, Margaret. This isn't just about us. It's about teaching them a lesson they won't soon forget. People like that, arrogant, dismissive, they think they can treat others however they want because of appearances. We have an opportunity to change that, even if it's just for one dealership." Seeing the determination in his eyes, Margaret relented. She knew there was no stopping Arthur once he set his mind to something. Still, she couldn't help but feel uneasy. "All right," she said softly. "But promise me you won't make a scene." Arthur chuckled, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Trust me, my dear. There won't be any scenes. Just a little reminder of humility." The next morning, Arthur woke up early. He dressed carefully, choosing a tailored navy blue suit that fit him perfectly, along with a crisp white shirt and a silk tie. Margaret, too, took extra care with her appearance, selecting an elegant dress she had worn to a wedding years ago. As they stood together in front of the mirror in their bedroom, Arthur smiled at her reflection. "You look beautiful," he said warmly. "Ready to teach them a lesson?" Margaret managed a small smile. "Let's just hope this goes better than yesterday." When they pulled into the dealership's parking lot later that morning, heads turned immediately. The Rolls-Royce glided smoothly into a prime spot near the entrance, its presence commanding attention. Customers and employees alike paused to admire the car, some snapping photos on their phones. Arthur stepped out first, straightening his jacket before offering his hand to help Margaret exit the vehicle. Together they walked toward the showroom doors, exuding an air of quiet authority that drew stares from everyone inside. The transformation in the salespeople was immediate. Gone were the dismissive glances and condescending smiles. Instead, they rushed forward, eager to assist the distinguished couple who had arrived in such a magnificent car. A young woman with a clipboard greeted them enthusiastically. Good morning. Welcome to our dealership. How may we assist you today? Arthur gave her a polite nod. Thank you. My wife and I are interested in exploring some of your finest models. Of course, the woman replied, gesturing for them to follow her. Right this way, please. As they moved through the showroom, Arthur took note of the sudden shift in attitude. The same salespeople who had ignored Margaret the day before were now bending over backward to accommodate them. Compliments flowed freely on Arthur's impeccable taste, on Margaret's grace and elegance, and offers of coffee, refreshments, and personalized tours were extended without hesitation. Arthur played along, asking detailed questions about the cars and engaging the staff in conversation, all while keeping a watchful eye on how they interacted with Margaret. At one point, a senior salesman approached them, clearly recognizing the value of someone who could afford a Rolls-Royce. Sir, if you don't mind me asking, what brings you here today? He inquired respectfully. Arthur smiled faintly. We visited yesterday, actually. My wife came alone and was looking for information about purchasing a car. Unfortunately, she didn't receive the assistance she deserved. The room fell silent for a moment as the implication sank in. The senior salesman glanced nervously at his colleagues, who avoided making eye contact. I'm terribly sorry to hear that, he stammered. Please allow us to make it right. Oh, don't worry, Arthur said smoothly. We're not here to buy anything today. We're here to remind you and your team of something far more important than sales figures. The tension in the air was palpable as Arthur prepared to deliver the lesson he had promised. Though Margaret remained silent, she watched with a mixture of apprehension and pride as her husband took control of the situation. Whatever happened next, she knew it would leave a lasting impression, not just on the dealership, but on anyone who heard the story afterward. The atmosphere in the showroom was thick with anticipation as Arthur stood calmly, his hands clasped behind his back. The senior salesman who had approached him earlier shifted uncomfortably, glancing around at his colleagues for support. None of them dared to speak. They simply waited, their eyes fixed on this mysterious man who had arrived in a Rolls-Royce and seemed to hold all the power in the room. Arthur took a deep breath, his expression calm but firm. Let me tell you a story, he began, his voice carrying just enough authority to silence any lingering murmurs. Yesterday my wife came here alone. She didn't come to waste anyone's time. She came because she was genuinely interested in purchasing a car. She saved her money carefully, worked hard her entire life, and wanted something reliable to make her daily errands easier. He paused, letting his words sink in. Margaret stood beside him, her posture straight and dignified, though her cheeks flushed slightly under the weight of so many eyes on her. Arthur continued, his tone measured but laced with quiet intensity. Instead of being treated with respect, she was dismissed. She was judged, not by her character or her intentions, but by her appearance. People saw her modest clothes and assumed she couldn't afford anything here. The salespeople exchanged uneasy glances, some looking down at their shoes while others fidgeted nervously. One young man, the same one who had laughed when Margaret mentioned her savings, swallowed hard, clearly recognizing himself in Arthur's description. Arthur turned his gaze toward the group, making sure to lock eyes with each of them before continuing. You see, wealth isn't always visible. Success doesn't always announce itself with flashy suits or expensive watches. Some people work quietly, live humbly, and still manage to achieve great things. My wife is one of those people. And yet yesterday, none of you bothered to find that out. The room grew even quieter, if possible. Even the customers browsing the cars stopped what they were doing, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Arthur's words weren't loud or angry. They were steady and deliberate, like the ticking of a clock, impossible to ignore. But today, he said, gesturing toward the Rolls-Royce parked outside, you've gone to the opposite extreme. You see this car, these clothes, and suddenly I'm worth your attention. Suddenly my wife is worth your respect. That tells me everything I need to know about how you operate. The senior salesman stepped forward hesitantly, his face pale. Sir, please accept our sincerest apologies. We clearly made a mistake yesterday, and we're deeply sorry for how your wife was treated. It won't happen again. I promise. Arthur studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. I believe you're sincere, But an apology isn't enough. Actions matter more than words. So let me propose something. Curiosity rippled through the room. What could this man possibly want? Were they about to lose a potential sale worth hundreds of thousands of dollars? Or worse, would he expose their behavior publicly and tarnish the dealership's reputation? "I'm not here to buy a car," Arthur said, answering their unspoken questions. "And I'm not interested in empty promises. What I am offering is a chance for you to learn from this experience, to grow as individuals and as a business." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black wallet. From it, he extracted several crisp $100 bills, which he placed on the counter near the coffee station. The staff stared at the money, confused. "What's this for?" the senior salesman asked cautiously. "This," Arthur replied, tapping the stack of bills, "is for you to use wisely. Each of you will take one of these and think carefully about what kindness costs. Treating someone with respect doesn't cost a cent. Listening to someone's needs doesn't require a single dollar. Yet yesterday, none of you could manage it. Today, I hope you'll remember that every customer who walks through those doors deserves the same level of care, no matter how they look or what they drive." The salespeople exchanged bewildered looks, unsure whether to reach for the money or wait for further instructions. Arthur smiled faintly, sensing their hesitation. "Take it," he urged, "but don't spend it on yourselves. Use it to do something good, for someone who might not have much, someone who reminds you of my wife. Buy groceries for a struggling family, donate to a charity, or simply pay it forward to another person in need. Whatever you choose, make sure it reflects the lesson you've learned today." One by one, the employees approached the counter, each taking a bill with a mixture of gratitude and shame. Some muttered quiet thank yous, while others simply nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. When the last person had taken their share, Arthur turned back to the group. "Remember," he said, his voice softening slightly, "respect isn't optional. It's a choice you make every day, and sometimes it takes losing a customer, or nearly losing one, to realize how important that choice really is." With that, he offered Margaret his arm, and together they walked toward the exit. As they passed the rows of gleaming cars, Margaret glanced up at Arthur, her lips curving into a small, proud smile. "Do you think they'll actually change?" she asked quietly. "They might," Arthur replied. "At the very least, they'll think twice before judging someone based on appearances. And if even one of them learns that lesson, it'll be worth it." Outside, the Rolls-Royce awaited them, its polished surface catching the sunlight. Arthur opened the door for Margaret, then slid into the driver's seat. As the engine purred to life, he glanced in the rearview mirror at the dealership behind them. The staff stood clustered near the entrance, watching the car disappear down the road. For a moment, there was silence between them, until Margaret broke it with a soft chuckle. "You know," she said, "I never thought I'd see the day when my husband taught a room full of salespeople a lesson in humility." Arthur grinned, his eyes twinkling. "Well, sometimes life surprises us. Now, where should we go next? Ice cream?" Margaret laughed, shaking her head. "Only if you promise not to turn it into another teaching moment." As the Rolls-Royce glided smoothly away from the dealership, the memory of what had just transpired lingered in the minds of everyone left behind. The staff returned to their duties, but the conversation buzzed among them long after Arthur and Margaret were gone. Word spread quickly about the elderly couple, the Rolls-Royce, and the unexpected lesson in humanity. By the end of the week, the dealership had implemented new training programs focused on customer service and inclusivity, ensuring that no one else would ever feel invisible again. For Margaret and Arthur, however, the day was far from over. They drove home sharing stories and laughter, knowing they had made a difference, not just in the lives of the people at the dealership, but in their own hearts as well. The drive home was filled with a mix of emotions for both Margaret and Arthur. Margaret felt a sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She also couldn't help but feel a little amused at how the tables had turned so dramatically in just 24 hours. Arthur, on the other hand, seemed deeply satisfied, not because he had proven a point, but because he knew they had sparked something meaningful. The incident wasn't just about teaching the dealership staff a lesson. It was about planting a seed of change that might grow into something bigger. As they pulled into their driveway, Arthur parked the Rolls-Royce carefully in the garage, treating it with the same care he would an old friend. Margaret stepped out first, smoothing her dress as she walked toward the house. "You know," she said over her shoulder, "I never thought I'd see you use that car for anything more than Sunday drives." Arthur chuckled, following her inside. "Neither did I," he admitted, closing the door behind them. "But sometimes, even old cars have a purpose." They settled into the living room where Margaret poured them each a cup of tea. Sitting side by side on their worn but comfortable couch, they began to reflect on what had happened. Margaret looked at Arthur thoughtfully. "Do you think they'll really change?" she asked, voicing the question that had been lingering in her mind since they left the dealership. Arthur sipped his tea, considering her words. "Some of them will," he said finally. "Not everyone, maybe. But if even one person starts thinking differently, if one of those salespeople decides to treat the next elderly woman or struggling family with kindness, it'll be worth it. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it has to start somewhere." Margaret nodded slowly, her gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the late afternoon sun bathed their garden in golden light. Birds chirped softly, and the gentle rustle of leaves provided a soothing backdrop to their conversation. For a moment, neither of them spoke, content to simply sit together in companionable silence. Then Margaret broke the quiet. "What do you think will happen now? At the dealership, I mean." Arthur set down his teacup and leaned back against the couch. "Well, word will spread," he said confidently. "People love a good story, especially one like this. By tomorrow, half the town will probably know about the old couple who showed up in a Rolls-Royce and taught the salespeople a lesson in humility. And when that happens, the dealership won't have much choice. They'll have to take action." He paused, a small smile playing on his lips. "They'll likely hold meetings, review their policies, maybe even bring in trainers to talk about customer service and respect. It won't fix everything overnight, but it's a start." Margaret raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And what about us? Do you think we'll hear from them again?" Arthur shrugged. "Maybe. They might try to reach out, apologize formally, or even offer some kind of gesture to make amends. But honestly, I don't expect much. What matters is that they've been given a chance to do better. Whether they take it is up to them." Margaret smiled faintly, feeling a renewed sense of pride in her husband. "You always were a man of principle," she said softly, "even when no one was watching." Arthur reached over and took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "We all deserve respect, Margaret. Rich or poor, young or old, it shouldn't matter. No one should ever feel invisible, not in a world where kindness costs nothing." Their conversation shifted as the evening wore on, moving from reflections on the day's events to lighter topics. They talked about their plans for the weekend, laughed about old memories, and debated which movie to watch later that night. Yet despite the lightheartedness, there was an undercurrent of satisfaction, a shared understanding that they had done something important. Meanwhile, back at the dealership, the ripple effects of Arthur and Margaret's visit were already beginning to show. The staff gathered in the break room after closing hours, still buzzing with disbelief over what had transpired. The senior salesman, whose name was Greg, stood at the front of the room, looking unusually somber. He cleared his throat to get everyone's attention. "Listen up, everyone," he began, his voice steady but tinged with regret. Today was a wake-up call for all of us. We messed up. Big time. That couple, the ones who came, in the Rolls-Royce, they weren't here to buy a car. They were here to teach us a lesson, and frankly, we deserved it." The room fell silent as Greg continued. "Yesterday, Mrs. Caldwell walked into this showroom, and instead of treating her with the respect she deserved, we judged her based on how she looked. We dismissed her without even trying to understand her needs. Then today, when her husband arrived in that incredible car, we bent over backward to impress him. It's embarrassing, and it's unacceptable." One of the younger salespeople, a woman named Lisa, raised her hand hesitantly. "So, what do we do now?" she asked. Greg exhaled deeply. "First, we apologize, not just to them, but to ourselves. We owe it to our customers to treat every single person who walks through those doors with dignity and respect. Starting tomorrow, we're implementing new training sessions focused on inclusivity and empathy. We're going to remind ourselves why we're in this business, to serve people, not stereotypes." The group nodded in agreement, though some still looked uneasy. Another employee, Mark, the same man who had laughed at Margaret the day before, spoke up quietly. "What about the money Mr. Caldwell gave us? What are we supposed to do with that?" Greg glanced at the stack of $100 bills sitting on the counter, untouched since Arthur had placed them there earlier. "He told us to use it wisely," he replied, "to do something good for someone else. So that's exactly what we're going to do." Over the next few days, the dealership staff pooled their resources and ideas, determined to honor Arthur's request. Some used their shares of the money to donate groceries to local food banks, while others contributed to charities supporting seniors' mobility programs. Mark, feeling particularly guilty about his behavior, volunteered at a community center, helping elderly residents learn how to use technology. Slowly but surely, the lessons Arthur and Margaret had imparted began to take root. Back at home, life returned to its usual rhythm for Margaret and Arthur. They tended to their garden, cooked meals together, and enjoyed long conversations on the porch. Yet, they couldn't help but notice the subtle changes around them. Neighbors stopped by more often, sharing stories about the buzz in town regarding the Rolls-Royce couple. Strangers greeted them warmly at the grocery store, and even the local newspaper featured a brief article praising their act of generosity and wisdom. For Margaret, the experience was transformative. She realized that her worth wasn't defined by how others perceived her, but by the strength and grace with which she carried herself. And for Arthur, it was a reminder of the power of leading by example. Together, they had shown that true wealth wasn't measured in material possessions, but in the ability to inspire change and uplift others. As they sat together one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, Margaret turned to Arthur with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said, "I think we made a difference, not just for those people at the dealership, but for ourselves too." Arthur smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "That's the thing about kindness, my dear," he said. "It always comes back to you in ways you least expect." And with that, they sat in peaceful silence, knowing they had left the world just a little brighter than they had found it. The days following their visit to the dealership passed quietly for Margaret and Arthur, but the ripple effects of their actions continued to spread throughout the town. Word of the Rolls-Royce couple traveled like wildfire, fueled by whispers. At coffee shops, grocery stores, and community centers, people were captivated not just by the dramatic turn of events, but also by the underlying message: kindness and respect should never be conditional. One morning, as Margaret watered her garden, she noticed a neighbor walking up the driveway. It was Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who lived 2 streets over. She carried a plate covered with foil, which she extended toward Margaret with a warm smile. "I heard about what happened," Mrs. Henderson said, her eyes twinkling. "Thought you might enjoy some lemon bars." Margaret accepted the gift, graciously inviting her neighbor to sit on the porch. As they chatted, Mrs. Henderson revealed that she had once been treated poorly at a local store because of her age. "It's nice to see someone stand up and remind people that we're all worthy of respect," she said earnestly. "You and Arthur have done something special." Margaret felt a swell of gratitude, not just for the kind words, but for the reminder that their actions had resonated beyond the dealership. Stories like this became more frequent in the weeks that followed. Strangers approached them at the library or post office, sharing tales of similar experiences and expressing admiration for how they handled the situation. Each encounter reinforced the idea that even small acts of courage could inspire others to reflect on their own behavior. Meanwhile, the dealership staff worked diligently to implement the changes Greg had promised. The first step was organizing mandatory training sessions focused on customer service and inclusivity. A professional consultant was brought in to lead workshops, emphasizing the importance of treating every customer with dignity, regardless of their appearance or perceived wealth. Role-playing exercises allowed employees to practice handling various scenarios, from assisting nervous first-time buyers to interacting with customers who seemed out of place. Lisa, one of the younger salespeople, threw herself into the process with surprising enthusiasm. During one session, she recounted her interaction with Arthur and Margaret, admitting how ashamed she felt when she realized she had judged Margaret unfairly. "I'll never forget the way Mr. Caldwell looked at me when he told us his wife had come in alone," she confessed to the group. "It made me realize how much power we have, to either lift someone up or tear them down. I don't want to make that mistake again." Her honesty inspired others to open up about their own biases and mistakes. Mark, who had laughed at Margaret the day before, admitted that he often dismissed customers based on superficial cues. "I thought I was being smart, focusing on high-value clients," he said, "but now I see how wrong I was. Everyone deserves a fair chance." The training session sparked meaningful conversations among the staff, fostering a sense of accountability and camaraderie. Slowly but surely, the culture within the dealership began to shift. Employees started greeting each customer with genuine warmth, asking thoughtful questions and taking the time to understand their needs. Even longtime patrons noticed the difference, commenting on how much friendlier and attentive the staff had become. In addition to the training, the dealership launched a community outreach program aimed at supporting seniors' mobility initiatives. Using the money Arthur had distributed, along with additional funds raised internally, they partnered with local organizations to provide discounted transportation services for elderly residents. Flyers advertising the program were posted around town, encouraging anyone in need to reach out for assistance. When Margaret and Arthur learned about the initiative, they couldn't help but feel proud. Though they hadn't sought recognition, the dealership sent them a formal letter of apology, along with an invitation to attend the launch event for the outreach program. The letter read, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell, we cannot express enough how deeply sorry we are for the way you were treated during your visits to our dealership. Your actions served as a powerful reminder of the values we strive to uphold but momentarily lost sight of. In honor of your generosity and wisdom, we have established a program to support seniors in our community, a cause we believe aligns closely with the lessons you imparted. We hope you will join us in celebrating this new chapter." Margaret read the letter aloud, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. When she finished, Arthur took it from her hands and set it aside. "What do you think?" he asked gently. She hesitated, considering the invitation. Part of her wanted to decline, it wasn't in her nature to seek attention, but another part recognized the importance of acknowledging the positive changes that had taken root. "Maybe we should go," she said finally. "Not for us, but for them. To show that we appreciate their efforts." Arthur nodded in agreement. "And maybe to remind ourselves that change is possible, even in places where it seems unlikely." On the day of the event, Margaret and Arthur arrived at the dealership dressed simply yet elegantly, drawing curious glances from attendees. The staff greeted them warmly, clearly eager to make amends. Greg, the senior salesman, delivered a heartfelt speech thanking them for their role in inspiring the outreach program. "This is just the beginning," he said, looking directly at Margaret and Arthur. "We owe it to you, and to everyone in this room, to keep improving." As the evening unfolded, Margaret and Arthur mingled with guests, listening to stories from seniors who had benefited from the new services. One woman, whose name was Ruth, approached them with tears in her eyes. "Because of this program, I can finally visit my grandchildren without worrying about how to get there," she said, clutching Margaret's hand. "Thank you for standing up and showing people what really matters." Margaret felt a lump rise in her throat, but she managed a soft smile. "It wasn't just us," she replied. "Everyone here played a part in making this happen." By the end of the night, Margaret and Arthur left the dealership feeling a renewed sense of hope. They had gone from being dismissed and humiliated to becoming catalysts for meaningful change, not through anger or vengeance, but through grace and humility. The experience had taught them that even the smallest acts of courage could spark a chain reaction, inspiring others to rethink their assumptions, and treat one another with greater kindness. Driving home under a canopy of stars, Margaret turned to Arthur with a contented sigh. "Do you think we'll ever stop hearing about the Rolls-Royce incident?" she teased. Arthur chuckled, his eyes reflecting the glow of the dashboard lights. "Probably not," he admitted. "But if it keeps reminding people to be better, to truly see each other, then I don't mind one bit." They shared a quiet laugh, their bond stronger than ever. In that moment, surrounded by the comfort of familiarity and the satisfaction of knowing they had made a difference, Margaret and Arthur realized something profound. True wealth wasn't measured in cars or accolades, but in the connections they forged and the lives they touched along the way. The weeks turned into months, and life in the small town settled into its usual rhythm. Yet the impact of Margaret and Arthur's actions continued to ripple outward, touching lives in ways they could never have anticipated. What had started as a single act of standing up against arrogance and prejudice had blossomed into a movement of reflection and change, not just within the dealership, but throughout the community. For Margaret, the experience had been transformative. She no longer felt the sting of invisibility that had haunted her after her first visit to the dealership. Instead, she carried herself with newfound confidence, knowing that her worth wasn't tied to how others perceived her. Whether she was shopping for groceries, attending church, or chatting with neighbors over tea, she exuded a quiet dignity that inspired those around her. People often remarked on how radiant she seemed, though few realized it stemmed from the inner strength she had discovered through adversity. Arthur, too, found himself reflecting on the lessons they had imparted and received in the process. He had always believed in living humbly and treating others with kindness, but this experience reinforced his conviction that even the smallest gestures could create waves of change. Watching the dealership staff grow more empathetic and inclusive filled him with pride, not because he sought recognition, but because it proved that people were capable of growth when given the chance. Their role as the Rolls-Royce couple became part of local lore, mentioned fondly at gatherings and recounted in stories shared between generations. Children in the neighborhood would sometimes wave excitedly as Margaret and Arthur strolled past, whispering to their parents about the legendary pair who had taught an entire dealership a lesson in humility. The couple took it all in stride, laughing gently at the attention while remaining steadfast in their belief that their actions were never meant to make them heroes, only catalysts for good. One crisp autumn morning, Margaret and Arthur decided to take a drive in the countryside. It was one of their favorite pastimes, a chance to escape the busyness of town and enjoy the beauty of nature. As they wound through tree-lined roads, leaves swirling like confetti in the breeze, Margaret broke the comfortable silence between them. "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if we hadn't gone back to the dealership?" she asked thoughtfully. Arthur glanced at her, his hands steady on the wheel. "Of course," he replied. "But I think things would have worked out either way. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Margaret. If we hadn't gone back, you still would have risen above it." Margaret smiled, touched by his words. "Maybe," she said softly. "But I'm glad we did. It feels good to know we made a difference, even if it was just for one place or one person." They drove on, eventually pulling over near a scenic overlook where golden fields stretched endlessly before them. Stepping out of the car, they stood side by side, taking in the breathtaking view. For a moment, neither spoke, content to simply exist in the serenity of the moment. Then Arthur turned to Margaret, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said, "this whole thing reminded me of something important." "What's that?" Margaret asked, curious. "That no matter how old we get, there's always room to learn and to teach," Arthur replied. "We may not be able to change the whole world, but we can plant seeds wherever we go. Some will grow, some won't, but every effort counts." Margaret nodded, her heart swelling with affection for the man beside her. "That's why I love you, Arthur Caldwell," she said with a playful grin. "You always manage to turn life's little moments into big lessons." Arthur chuckled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "And you keep me grounded, Margaret Caldwell. That's why we make such a good team." As they stood there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, They reflected on the journey they had taken together. Not just the physical trips in their vintage Rolls-Royce, but the emotional ones as well. From the indignity of being dismissed at the dealership to the joy of seeing positive change unfold, they had navigated it all with grace and resilience. And, through it all, their love for each other had only deepened. Back in town, the legacy of their actions continued to flourish. The dealership's outreach program expanded, offering free transportation services to seniors during holidays and special events. Local businesses began implementing similar initiatives, inspired by the example set by Greg and his team. Conversations about inclusivity and respect became commonplace, sparking a cultural shift that extended far beyond the confines of the showroom. Even the media took notice. A regional newspaper published a feature article highlighting the story of Margaret and Arthur, dubbing them Guardians of Grace. The piece emphasized not just their wealth and generosity, but their unwavering commitment to treating others with dignity. Readers flooded the paper with letters of admiration, many sharing their own stories of overcoming bias or finding inspiration in the couple's actions. Despite the acclaim, Margaret and Arthur remained humble. They declined interviews and avoided the spotlight, preferring to let their deeds speak for themselves. To them, the real reward lay in knowing they had sparked a chain reaction of kindness, one that showed no signs of slowing down. One evening, as they sat together on their porch, wrapped in blankets against the chill of approaching winter, Margaret looked at Arthur with a mischievous glint in her eye. "Do you think we'll ever take the Rolls-Royce out again?" she teased. Arthur raised an eyebrow, pretending to consider the question. "Only if another dealership needs a lesson," he joked, earning a laugh from Margaret. Their laughter faded into a peaceful silence, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl and the gentle rustle of leaves. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the comforts of home and the warmth of shared memories, Margaret and Arthur knew they had achieved something extraordinary, not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through simple acts of courage and compassion. As the stars emerged one by one in the velvet sky, Margaret leaned her head against Arthur's shoulder, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude for their life together, for the lessons they had learned, and for the countless lives they had touched along the way. Together, they had proven that true wealth wasn't measured in material possessions but in the connections forged, the kindness extended, and the lasting impact left behind. And so, under the vast expanse of the night sky, Margaret and Arthur sat hand in hand, content in the knowledge that they had made the world just a little brighter, a testament to the power of humility, love, and the enduring human spirit.